And so tonight we are delighted that we have a panel of very distinguished speakers who will be able to both give some perspective on the world that we currently live in, as well as the history of how we got here and some potential guesses of what the future might hold. I'm going to turn it over to Don to briefly introduce our speakers and kick us off tonight. So Don Sanford is a board member, past president, and our moderator extraordinaire. He is very keen on asking questions tonight because we have three distinguished panelists and we want to make sure we get to hear what they have to say. Dr. James Lindsay is at the Council on Foreign Relations. Ambassador Alina Romanowski is awaiting another appointment. No, retired now. Okay. But
Thank you very much, but no.
She wants to go back to Iraq.
She served as U.S. Ambassador to Iraq and as U.S. Ambassador to Kuwait. Ambassador Marc Grossman served as Ambassador to Turkey, but that's probably the introductory level of where you served. He retired as the third in charge of our U.S. State Department. So we have terrific guests with terrific history, and they've got a lot to tell us. Take us away, Don.
Well, first, I'm going to thank Mike Mangold again. I told him to put an extra plug. He's one of my former students at Eureka, and I bleed my former students that have businesses, and I've really worked him over. So I felt he wanted to be here tonight, but he had to go to Chicago. But Mike has been really special. The three that we have here, we could go on for 20 minutes. Unless you're, a nerd like me that follows all of this, I appreciate just how significant these three panelists are. For the average person does follow the same, well, yeah, they've got nice titles and so on, but this is really an outstanding group. I came up with this idea for this program a year ago last June. I was in Bastogne and thinking of the 80th anniversary of that and thinking how I'm 75 students, so I've seen a lot, and I was struggling to think about how this world how the United States is changing in its role in leadership, and I thought we need to do a program on that. It worked out good with Trump's second administration because then we've seen a real speed up with it. I was telling them that this is a historic time, and you students aren't going to quite appreciate it right now. For me, the fall of the wall was a big change in the international order. But here we've seen the United States build something for almost 80 years, and now we're going to see countries take on different roles, different responsibilities, and we'll go back maybe to some of the things that we're pulling out of now and so on. But that world is going to be different. It's just not going to go back to the way that we have been used, and especially the two ambassadors, the world that they've represented and in diplomatic circles. So that's the reason behind this, that hopefully will give you, especially you students, maybe a little bit more insight as to what's going on. Usually I do ask a lot of questions. Right now I've got three because I broke it down into three phases. There was going to be four, but I knew we'd totally run out of time. I'm going to assume you know something about the international order, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, United Nations, NATO, World Trade Organization, and so on, and the benefits. I'm sure you'll allude to those somewhat, but tonight I thought we really need to focus in what caused Americans to become disillusioned with that world order. And where are we right now with the dismantling of that world order? And then we'll take a peek at how it might shape out. So that's what I've kind of directed them. And I'm going to let them kind of free flow. And then if they say something that I can play devil's advocate and raise their blood pressure, I'll jump in at that point. So we'll represent another view. So, excuse me. My first question is, despite its longstanding prominence and success, the post-World War II international order is today facing growing resistance and skepticism within the United States itself. So it's important to understand what factors are fueling this shift in American attitudes towards global engagement. So I'd like you to explore the roots of this disillusionment, and you can also talk about the strengths that we're ignoring, but mainly what went wrong.
Before I take on that question, let me, I hope on behalf of the panel, just thank you all for being here. Thank all of the organizers, all of the sponsors. One of the things that I have found, certainly in my last few years, is how much I value the World Affairs Councils of America, how much I value individual councils, and the Peoria Council is one of my favorites. And so whenever Angela calls and says, would you please do this for me? The answer to that question is yes, of course I would. The other thing I think that's really fantastic tonight is all of the students that have come from all the various organizations. We were talking a little bit about before about the importance to students of this continued enthusiasm for America, America in the world, trying to find out how to participate in that, in the Foreign Service, in the civil service, through academia, through think tanks. So thank you to the students who are interested in this. So thank you very much. I was thinking really that the title of this evening, this panel, The World We Made. And in many ways, all three of us had a part in making this world, just like so many of you did. And so the question that you asked, Don, about, so what happened here? How do we get to this place? And the first thing I would say, I think it's really important to recognize, at least for me, I give you this thought, that this question and questioning of the rules-based international order, the world we made, it didn't start in 2016 and it didn't start in 2024. I think these are trends that have been going on in the United States for a very long time. And yes, they're accelerated now. I see that. But if you think about what's happened in our country over the last 20 or 25 years or 30 years to so many people here, you see, I think, why it is that people are questioning this rules-based international order. I'll give you parentheses about that as well. I think if you went around to a lot of people and said, do you support the rules-based international order? They would have no idea what you were talking about. Right? It's all the things that Don said, we lived. But, you know, what's that mean? Right? Well, it meant a certain way for the United States to live inside the world and the world to live with the United States. But you think about what's happened in the United States over the past 20 or 30 years, and it's not a surprise to me that people are questioning this order. You know, between 2000 and 2016, most American workers, they didn't get a pay raise. And what did they see? They saw their communities hollowed out. Jobs went away, communities destroyed. And it wasn't just economic questions, right? How is it that we had 30, 40, 50,000 people a year die of opioid addiction in the United States of America? What's that tell you about people's communities? And I think people became very concerned about this question. They looked at this world international order and they said, you know, this order must be working for somebody, but it doesn't work for me. And I think when people came to that conclusion, they said, number one, I'm not reaping the economic benefits of those who benefited from globalization, right? And I did, but not everybody did. And secondly, I think in the United States, little by little, people started to think to themselves, are we really still sovereign, right? Can we make our own decisions about our own country? And I think that's a really important thing. And so the Trump administration, as you said, has accelerated some of these trends, but this didn't start yesterday. This is something that I think we've been facing for a long time, and therefore it's harder to deal with. But the more we recognize that fact, the better off we're going to be.
I'm a little bit of a contrarian, and because I think Don challenged us that if we don't take a different view, he's going to force it on us. So, and also as someone who sort of started their career as an analyst, I never got to the point, and then subsequently I had to make recommendations. I'm not sure I ever made a decision. So I'm going to start from, and also I'm in front of my boss, my former boss anyway. You know, I think everything that Ambassador Grossman said, I agree with 100%, not just because he was my boss, but I also think there's another context to put this in. All of this disillusionment, this expectation didn't start yesterday or 10 years ago. If you're a student of history, which I was, and continue to be, this goes on all the time. This sort of what I call a recalibration or an effort to, like, globalization. It was a great term and we had to define it. Also, we're very impatient as human beings. When we come up with a great idea and we want to implement it, we want success. We want it to achieve the solution. And so much of what we do as diplomats and as those who are trying to engage in the world for our own interests, we want to reap the benefits right away. I'm not being an apologist for the fact that, you know, all these promises that various administrations, 30 for the last, 44 years that I've been working, have promised that if you do this, this will happen. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't work. And I think what we are facing right now, we've been in a very comfortable position where we have been supporting multilateral institutions. We have been in a place where we have tried very hard as the Americans and as the United States to bring peace around the world, to try to move our countries that are sort of emerging either as democracies or as experimenting with different governance models, because we think that democracy here is the best. And frankly, I still believe that. It is the best form. It is messy. It is imperfect. It is difficult. But it is one where the citizens participate. It's not a monarchy. It's not a dictatorship. Citizens have a voice, and that's what we have to preserve. But in this idea that somehow what went wrong, it didn't go wrong. It just didn't go necessarily the way we wanted. And so what does that mean? So are we going to throw globalization out and become isolationists? I don't believe that that's going to help us in the long run. We have to adapt. We have to change how we engage. We have to take different approaches because we tried other approaches and they didn't produce the results we wanted. So what I would say we're doing right now is we are flipping, in many ways, this administration is flipping the script and how we work with allies. They're throwing, and partners and our enemies. They are throwing out a lot of the conventional assumptions that we've operated on. Is that good or bad? I don't know, because we haven't finished implementing that. So, you know, this president has a style that is pretty unique when you look at it in the context of foreign policy and engaging. Very clear that it's a transactional approach. If you do this, this is what we'll give you. And it's very clear. It's not murky. It shouldn't be confusing to those who this administration is engaging with. But it is upending a lot of the assumptions that and how is it manifesting itself? Very transactionally. It is a new cocktail, as I would say, of cooperation and coercion. And it lacks, in my view, a strategy. In every administration I've worked with, and I think the rest of it, they have within the first, if they don't come in with a national security strategy already written or half written, they do it very quickly. By the end of the first year, it's out there. And it's the blueprint of what we're doing. This administration, I don't think, has a plan to write one.
Well, they're on the hook to produce one within the next several weeks.
Well, right. But that's an
It's
afterthought.
congressionally mandated, so.
Right, but it's a little bit of, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to do it.
Well,
Chatham House rules. But again, it is not as if this administration is coming with some sort of strategy other than it's transactional, and we're going to dismantle some of what they believe didn't work. And I think that's where we're headed. And every day we get up and we turn on the TV, whatever news feed that you read, that you listen to, and I hope it's multiple, not just one, there's something new that they're trying and experimenting with, just because it's new and different and it's not the past. And frankly, maybe there may be some good things and there will be some, we already see that there are some things that are very disruptive to certain regions, and we'll get into that.
All right, Jim, are you going to give us a more academic look maybe at it, or
Dawn,
think tank?
I'm gonna try to be conversational on this. Just on one point, I hope we can get back to really one thing that Ambassador Romanowski talked about, and that is, what would a strategy look like? And do we think, to the extent that there's something like a strategy or an embryonic strategy, do we really think it's going to work?
Next question.
Yeah, I think that would be very important too. A lot of smart things have been said. Let me try to complexify things, since I have a PhD and I have a certificate that allows me to complexify things. Let me make a broad observation. If you look at polling data, an interesting thing comes up. The Chicago Council, Global Affairs. I serve on an advisory committee, so full disclosure, for the public polling operation, has since 1972 asked Americans, should the United States play an active role in the world or not? What is really interesting is that the percentage of Americans who say an active role, the United States should play an active role in the world today, is actually about mid-range of the last 50 plus years. Certainly much higher than in the 1980s, actually the lowest point in the survey in terms of whether people believing America should be involved in the world was in 1982, during the presidency of Ronald Reagan. I point this out because what I want to suggest is we have a tendency to talk about public opinion, to make broad assumptions about what the American people think. But there are sort of two elements to public opinion, and maybe even a third. One is sort of what the average opinion is. Public opinion polls great at that. There's also the question of the intensity with which opinions are held. And the reality in politics is that the squeaky wheel gets the grease, okay? Particularly if people who are unhappy can find a tribune for their anger. In here, the significant difference came in 2016 when the American people, by hair's breadth, selected Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton. Donald Trump gave voice to a view of the world that had existed going back to the end of World War II, but had never had a spokesperson. The Republican Party had produced people like Dwight Eisenhower, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush, who had a very decided commitment to this, we'll call it rules-based order, but really a notion of American leadership, of an American-led world order. They saw it as the key to American success, prosperity, and security. Donald Trump never agreed with that, beginning with the ad he took out on September 2nd, 1987, the Boston Globe, Washington Post, New York Times, with a long screed about how all of our friends, partners, and allies were picking our pockets. Okay, so what happened was is you have a moment in which somebody comes in who has a very different worldview. Now, I think so you have to ask the question, why is it that those people were angry? What is it? And I think Ambassador Grossman put his finger on it. There is a sense for many Americans that something has fundamentally gone wrong in this country, that the American dream is not achievable. And I would actually argue that 4 of the last 5 presidential elections were essentially change elections, where the electorate was angry, wanted to throw the incumbents out, they pulled the lever, they were promised change, and nothing happened. Okay, so we end up in a situation in which you have a lot of unhappiness. Now, the story is often told that unhappiness is because of globalization. That is the conventional wisdom in Washington, D.C., that because the United States chose economic integration with the world, We got bad trade deals and that hollowed out America. Now, I don't want to dismiss the reality of the so-called China shock, the surge of Chinese exports to the United States in the 2000s, particularly if I'm here in the heartland of the United States. Okay, and I just want to point out, I lived for 12 years about 150 miles west of here.
We love Walmart.
Okay. Well, I'm not even, I don't want to get into the Walmart issue, but trade was definitely a part. But let me point out that if you talk to economists, they will tell you that technology has done more to undermine American jobs than anything else. Okay? That is a reality. You need fewer people to produce the same amount than you did 50 years ago. That's not about globalization. But beyond that, there's a broader unhappiness that it isn't tied to trade policy. I mean, people would say it wasn't globalization that made the United States invade Iraq, squander trillions, and show nothing for it. It wasn't globalization that made the United States ignore the risks of subprime mortgage lending, leading to a global financial crisis that almost ruined the global economy, but impoverished lots of Americans. It wasn't globalization that led the United States government to enact a tax code that favors the wealthy over the poor, that encourages corporations to book profits overseas, and that has led to a flow of red ink, meaning that we now have roughly $39 trillion in debt. Okay, it wasn't globalization that led the country not to invest in infrastructure, not to invest in workforce development, not to invest in education. Okay, there are a lot of things the US government, the political system, I'm not going to blame either party, but the system collectively failed to do. And I think that's the root of the unhappiness. In many ways, trying to find an outlet, it gets focused on things like trade deals, but our problems run deeper. And I think Ambassador Romanowski is quite right. I'll go further. I'm not afraid of making a prediction about the future. Our current economic policies to respond to the situation we have are wrongheaded, won't work. It will make us worse off.
We'll kind of address that too on the
Okay.
last question that we do here. All right, I'm going to move you now to the second phase because I think probably just the second and third we'll get even more discussion and different opinions maybe on this. Now, the Trump administration marked a distinct departure from previous U.S. foreign policies by actively challenging established international norms and alliances, and you've already mentioned some of that. This directly impacted the architecture of the global order that has been in place for decades. I'd like you to discuss the specific ways that they are redefining America's role in the world and the broader implications. But before you do, one of the things to remember is that much of the world, or many places in the world, applauded the election of Donald Trump because that they believed America would no longer spread its values, act as a global defender. In other words, tell other countries what they needed to do. And there's been a little bit of a history of some things going on. You, former CIA, we know some Guatemala, Iran, and so on. And those countries remember all that. And so for them, oh man, if we get the United States to quit doing that, we'll let them withdraw. So there is an element of the world. And also we should remember there is a far right, very strong movement in Europe also that's it's not just here in the United States as well. So I would like to get your thoughts on what's been going on. Oh, and we needed to make a clarification. I didn't talk to you about this. We've got to clarify President Trump versus the ideologues in his administration, Steve Bannon, Stephen Miller, Russell Vought, and so on.
Well, Steve Bannon is not in the administration.
Right, or
It may
not in,
just seem like it, but he's
old
not.
one, yeah. But he is a real thought provocateur behind the scenes for a lot of people across the globe. They drive the ideology of many things. As we pointed out, Trump is not an ideologue. He is honest with what he said. He works from his gut. He doesn't want to learn about an issue. And that's not saying as a derogatory, he's just pointed that out. My gut, that's how I'm going to do it today. with it, which is now, oh, are we going to invade it, Venezuela? American firsters aren't really thrilled with that. So there's going to be some pushback, I think. So we need to separate him, I think, from the movement that's going to try to keep some things in place. So for the young people here, that's to talk about Trump makes it a little more difficult than to talk about the ideologies that are driving things. So how have we, you've addressed it a little bit, how are we redefining with this administration America's role in the world? So let's, Ambassador, we'll start with you, because the last one I'm going to start with you.
Okay. Cool.
Okay, well, let me use, I'm a Middle East expert, or at least I pretend to be, and have worked on Middle East issues pretty much all my career. So I'm going to answer your question in the context of the Middle East and what we're doing there. And I'll let more of my globalist colleagues speak about China and others. But to your point, the Middle East has been a region of conflict, and we have, because of our traditional superpower position and the fact that we were a credible, very credible, and pretty much the only country with the kind of the power, the influence, and the interest in really trying to, and our support for Israel, which was very important in driving much of what of our interests there, and oil at one time. We took the lead role. In as much as we would like to change that, I don't think that's really going to happen. But I will say how we deal with crisis and how the region is changing because of crises is both because the way in which this administration has, again, changed and taken a different approach on engaging, but it's also the region itself is changing. It's almost organically. And let me give you a couple of examples quickly. So probably the most significant thing that has changed the region and how it's looking at itself and engaging with us is because of October 7th. The Israeli leadership is different. The Palestinian leadership is not different, but the reality of October 7th has pointed that it has to change. It's going to come along quickly, but it has to change. Iran, its proxies in Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, to some extent Iraq, and I'll talk about that a little later. They're mostly defeated. Middle East leaders, especially those with money, want their investments to reduce dependence on fossil fuels and also to create innovative economic growth based on very different things than because they see that oil isn't here forever and they need other alternatives. And frankly, the one thing that was very clear to me while I was serving there, people are tired of the same old conflict. They can't find a solution. And the United States has been at the center for the last 50 years of trying to find a solution. We got close, then it fell apart. We took a different strategy. Under this administration, basically, the president has decided, I'm a very good friend of Prime Minister Netanyahu. I'm a very loyal partner and ally with Israel, but that does not mean I'm not going to tell you how to run things. Now, whether the prime minister and Israelis are going to agree with him, but he's definitely doubling down. Well, as you were saying, we are telling people in the Middle East what they should be doing and have been for a long, long time. The difference here is that I think President Trump wants a return on his investment. Let's go to Syria. That's probably another place as a result of October 7th, where we're changing the approach. This President Shara, who was a designated terrorist for years, was sitting in the White House on Monday, talking to the President of the United States. This president will sit down, and he has decided, I'm going to open a conversation with a former terrorist. Why? Because that former terrorist has signaled that he wants Syria to look different after Bashar al-Assad went to Russia. So instead of the sort of, I will criticize the way we always approach the Middle East, let's see how the terrorists sort of change their stripes slowly, and we're going to incentivize them. This president said, no, I'm going to suspend the sanctions. I'm going to give this president a chance. Will it work? Maybe. We'll see. He owns this now, the approach. Everyone said, well, this is, this laundry list of things that you have to ask the Syrians to do, they haven't fulfilled, but we're working it. He's working it directly. We have special envoys working that problem. That's a very different approach. And it's one that sort of turns over the usual approach. What did we get out of it? Syria joined the global coalition to defeat ISIS. ISIS essentially is defeated, but not in Syria. And we need that president, we need President Shah to double down. So in exchange for coming to the United States, he has to join, and now that's putting him on the hook for going after the pockets of ISIS that continue to exist in Syria. There are lots of other issues, laundry lists that they exchange about what they should do, how they should do it, but it's a direct discussion. And as diplomats, there's nothing better than being 3 feet apart when you're trying to negotiate. Let's go to, let me touch quickly on Iraq. Iraq just had elections, and you were saying, we had this sort of what looked like a forever war with the Iraqis. But the reality is, this election that just occurred on Tuesday was a much more peaceful, predictable election that at least the Iraqis believed and came to voting, and the 60% of the 56% of the eligible voters actually went to the polls, which was striking compared to the last one. And so the progress that Iraq has been making as we have pulled back and we have changed our efforts to move our relationship away from a security relationship to an economic relationship, produced an election that the Iraqis at least hope will continue a governance structure and efforts to bring a better foreign investment. There are a lot of problems. You have sectarianism, but this was probably the second election where we didn't really try to manipulate around it. And then finally, I'll just touch base very quickly on Iran. That is a big question. So Iran is on its back foot, but probably most significantly, if we're looking at the future and how we're going to deal with the Iranians. And right now, the president has resurrected his maximum pressure campaign. Iran is really on the cusp of a leadership change. Ayatollah Khamenei, is likely to leave the scene in the next 5 years, if you're looking at actuarial data. And how the Iranians what that succession is going to look like, if you just want to look at the bookends, it could be, the continuation of this Islamic theocracy, or it could be a coup, a complete change, a revolution again, and anything in between. But the question is, how are we going to approach that? And how are we going to shape it so that we either continue to see the Iranian, and of course how it turns out will depend a lot on how we see the Iranians, and if we continue to isolate the Iranians, or whether there's an opportunity. But there's another opportunity for President Trump, and if it happens under another administration, to take it a different approach. So part of our ability to take that different approach is because the region itself has changed. That region is tired of conflict. They want to engage in the world in a very different way. Their citizens need jobs, their youth, which is huge, well, they need opportunity. And they still see the United States, notwithstanding all the issues on Israel and our presence there, They still see the United States as not so much the guarantor of security, but as a country that they know brings investment, brings the rule of law, rules-based order, and they need that.
Jim, can you, whoops, get this on here. From your perspective, what have you seen? And I want to talk more about your book and Ivo Dowder's with the Empty Throne, but what have you seen, especially this second administration, about what they're specifically doing to change the world order?
I'm happy to do that. But I want to go back to the question you asked the ambassador, because I'm not sure I would describe the administration the way you have. And I guess I want to preface my remarks by saying, because we're not talking about prior presidents and the mistakes they were made. I don't want to come across as if everything was done really well from Harry Truman through Joe Biden, and it was only mistakes under Donald Trump. My guess is if we could get the ambassadors here, we could come together with a pretty good list of bad decisions or maybe good decisions that were poorly executed. We can talk about agencies that didn't work or should be revamped or maybe closed down. So I don't want to come across as saying that there was some golden era in which everything went really well and they were giants who got everything right. And now all of a sudden we have an administration that can't get anything done. Second thing I want to just emphasize is that the world is a very complicated and at times very messed up place in which it is very hard to, quote, solve things. This is not like being an orthopedic surgeon where somebody has a broken leg and then you set it and go on their way. In this world, as powerful as the United States is and has been, oftentimes the best you can hope for is just to manage a situation to keep it from getting worse. In that way, it's more like dealing with a chronic disease in which you're trying to minimize outbursts, and then you're really happy when you have stages of remission. So I want to put all that out there. But where I want to go back to your original question, Dawn, is about the president. There's always a tendency in my business to want to elevate the staff, the advisors above the president of the United States. So I just wanted to declare my sort of worldview, which is presidents matter. And I think this president matters a heck of a lot. Donald Trump may not be a strategist, okay, but Donald Trump has very strong opinions on a select number of issues, and he drives this administration. I think fundamentally, when you think about President Trump does not accept the same assumptions about the world and America's role in it that his predecessors did. Now, again, I'm not saying that George Bush and Barack Obama saw eye to eye. They obviously didn't, but they accepted some basic beliefs about America's role in the world. President Trump has long held that, in essence, the world is a tough place. And if I can quote Thucydides in the Peloponnesian War and the Melian dialogue, it's a place where the strong do as they will and the weak suffer as they must. There are no friends. Indeed, the president said this endlessly, long before he became president, that America's allies were more threatening than America's adversaries because your allies are patting you on the back while they pick your pocket. Okay, that is his worldview. And his worldview is if you are more powerful, you will get your way. Now, anyone who's been the parent of a toddler knows that's not necessarily true. Okay, however, that is the view the president has. And besides having that basic instinct, the president also has irritations and impulses, which is why quite often what he does doesn't seem to add up, or it goes back and forth one day to another. And one day the Steve Bannons of the world are happy. Next day they're really upset. Why are we going to Venezuela? And I don't want to suggest that presidential advisors don't matter. I think they matter particularly a lot with the president, who may have strong preferences on some issues, but is indifferent to a lot of other things. And there's a long history, and it's not just this administration in which advisors try to get the president's ear to move the president toward a policy that they favor in a way from something else. That is not particular to the Donald Trump administration. And I think, look right now on Venezuela, it's very clear that Secretary Rubio, who has long wanted to overturn the government of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, both because he doesn't like Maduro, and no one can do a positive brief for President Maduro, but also because of the belief that if you could change the government in Caracas, it would have a ripple effect. That ripple effect, because Venezuela produces oil that helps sustain other governments, is you could overturn the government of Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, but most important, you could change the government in Cuba. Now, we can debate about how likely that is. I think it's very unlikely, but that nonetheless is a worldview. And clearly, they've gotten the president's ear. Now, again, the one thing, and the other thing I should say, besides having instincts and impulses, the president also has irritations. The Brazilians decide to put their ex-president in jail, and next thing you know, we're slapping tariffs on them. The president kind of reacts to what's happening. He writes to the president of Israel and demands that Bibi Netanyahu be pardoned, which the president of Israel can't do because he hasn't been convicted of anything. Okay, but having said that, I also think it's an important point. It alludes to something that Ambassador Romanowski said, which is not everything Donald Trump does is wrong. Not every problem he identifies is not a problem. He's not imagining things. And I think part of that, and again, potentially one of his great strengths is his willing to try to do different things. And I think one could fairly say that one of the challenges this administration, his prior administration had, is that they had a very hard time articulating a way to get to whatever goal they wanted. And this is particularly the case in this administration, which oftentimes seemed to be working at odds with itself. So the president wants the trade deficit to come down. But at the same time, we pass a tax bill that's going to raise the size of the federal deficit. Well, one of the things that you learn in basic macroeconomics is that when you increase the federal deficit, you end up importing more, exacerbating your problem. I can go through a whole laundry list of other issues where what the administration is doing here is running directly opposite what's happening over there. And there's one thing I want to make a real strong push for the business my two panelists were in, which is people who are in government in Washington are really experienced. That experience matters because they know that it is fundamental to identify what your objectives are, to have priorities, and know to chart a course to get from where you are to where you want to be. Okay. Government works a lot better when it's more like classical music than it is like jazz. We just sort of throw the ball out and have a scrum. And I know the State Department is being remade, and I actually worry about that because I worry about a loss of institutional memory, institutional knowledge, because at the end of the day, you can have great ideas, but if you don't know how to sequence them, if you don't know how to enact them, you're at sea.
There's just so many things we could go into greater detail with on here. Ambassador Grossman, it's a world that you've represented and represented other countries. What have you seen as the big changes?
Well, thanks. I'm not sure I have very much to add to what my colleagues have said here. Just let me try to make 3 or 4 points. Number one, just to go to the point that Dr. Lindsay just made about diplomacy, and I appreciate what you say, and I thank you for it. Both Ambassador Romanowski, myself, others, we tried our best to represent the United States of America and protect and defend American interests. But I also wanted to tie the other point that you made, which I think is really important, is the past was not golden perfect. Right? So if you say, I say, thank you very much, but diplomacy needs to be changed. The State Department needs reform. We can't do the things, we just do them over and over and over again. And so for many years, a number of us have been trying to get the State Department to change. And so I think it's really important as you consider where we are in this world that, and I think we'll come a lot to that, maybe perhaps in your third question, where is this going? Among the things I'm pretty sure of is it's not going back to the way it was. And that's certainly true in the practice of diplomacy. Second thing I would say, and you both may disagree with this, and there are many people here who will disagree with it. And I'm not a spokesperson for the Trump administration by any means, but I think it's important that you look at what it is they're trying to say and trying to accomplish in certain areas. And I guess I see anyway, a little bit more strategic thinking perhaps than you two might. And I take the example of trade, because we were talking about this before. And this doesn't for a second mean that, you know, you're not 100% right in your prognostication that this isn't going to work. But if you look at what people are saying, if you look, for example, and if you haven't seen it, I would recommend it to you. A couple of weeks ago at the Council on Foreign Relations, Council on Foreign Relations was wise enough to invite the U.S. Trade Representative, Peter Navarro, to make public comments in New York, or I think in New York.
No, he
was
did
in
it,
Washington.
and to be, Jamison Greer is the USTR.
Yes,
Peter Navarro
right.
just holds a White House
Yes,
post.
I'll come to-
I don't want to get in trouble
No,
for
I'll come to-
elevating one or
I'll
demoting
come
someone
to
else.
Jamison Greer in a second. My fault. So Peter Navarro, I think very rightly, is invited to the Council on Foreign Relations. And if you haven't watched at least the first 15 minutes of that presentation, it's worth watching, because this isn't, I don't think, a series of random ideas. There's thought here. And now I'd move to Jamison Greer, the USTR. Thank you very much. So he has written in the New York Times and other places about why is it that we pursue this tariff policy. And he says it's for two reasons. Reason number one is that they'd like to move the culture in the United States from a culture based on debt to a culture based on production. And secondly, and they call that a conservative culture. And secondly, to increase the capacity, as we talked about before, of sovereignty, right? The ability of the United States of America to make its own decisions. And you can agree or you can disagree. But I think in this particular case, there's some thought being given to this, and I don't know how it's going to turn out, but I think there is some thought and some strategy here. I think if you ask me, Don, other places, and Ambassador Romanowski talked about a lot of them, Dr. Lindsay talked about a lot of them, the Middle East, other places, but you see where there's a big change in our relationship with NATO. So we spent our lives trying to get NATO allies to spend 2% on defense, which they had promised to do, and we never succeeded. But something different has happened now, and that number's gone from 2 to 3.5, 3.5 to 5 as a total. And you see the relationship in a different way with Japan and the Republic of Korea, where the conversation is, as both my colleagues have said, is a different conversation. And I guess I would leave you just with this thought to consider. Maybe we can talk a bit about it in the question and answer period. But the question I've been asking myself, and Lindsay talked about Thucydides, and that's a good place to start here. So I've been thinking to myself, Don, in answer to your question, is what if the period from 1945 or 1947 to 2016 that we all thought was perfectly normal is in fact the outlier.
Yep.
And that indeed those 80 years had so many positive aspects. Not all of them, but many. But if you think about how the world was organized or disorganized for the many hundreds and maybe thousands of years before that, it was different. And what I think is we're headed into a period now of where the world is going to look more like it looked before, rather than in that 80-year period. And I don't know how to articulate that exactly, and maybe someday, you know, I'll write an article for Foreign Affairs, but it seems to me that we have to be open to this idea that what we considered normal might in fact be the outlier here.
Can I just jump in quickly to that? Because I think you put your finger on something very important, Ambassador, which is if you go back and read the memoirs, the conversations that were had, actually during World War II and immediately after FDR, then Harry Truman, George C. Marshall, Dean Acheson, a whole lot of other people, they were trying to solve a problem. And the problem was exactly what the ambassadors referred to. That world out there of geopolitical competition was incredibly dangerous. It was incredibly dangerous, they knew, because it produced not one, but two world wars. And they actually had a fairly sophisticated diagnosis of why we ended up with a second world war. Part of it was about the surge of nationalism. Part of it was about predatory economics, beggar thy neighbor policies. Their solution to that was not to extract a victor's peace in which the United States, because it was the last country standing, was going to extract whatever it could from the defeated countries. It was actually basically to exercise enlightened self-interest. They made a calculation that if you could put relations on a better, more regularized, rules-based footing, that you gave a chance for other countries to succeed, they would grow, but you would also grow. In essence, classic win-win proposition. That was a really big bet. And it was very much contested at the time. Okay. And it paid off. It paid off many times over for the security, prosperity of the United States. And for people who argue, no, it was a bad idea for America to get entangled, we should have obeyed Washington's great rule of conduct, I will simply point out that when you look at the military interventions the United States has had, that Americans today would say were a really bad idea, almost none of our allies wanted us to do them. That was the case in Vietnam. It was most certainly the case in Iraq. And some of our closest allies said these ideas are dumb as dishwater. Okay, you do not have to do it. And we said, we know better.
And just to piggyback on and to further expand your point, and the Middle East is an interesting case in that because of the conflicts that we jumped in. And it is absolutely true. At some point, you don't want these forever wars. You don't want, but what happened? These countries actually had to start their own development, their own security. And I think we have come to, I think Ambassador Grossman's point, after 80 years, 50 years, 40 years, it's now time to take them off the tricycle, put on the bicycle wheels and say, okay, we're not going to be the same United States there. We will be engaged in the region for our interests. We will forge different interests, but we're not going to be the guarantors. We're not going to be giving foreign assistance that is forever, not because we're not a generous nation, but because it's time for countries to make the reforms that we've been asking them to do, and they've been slow. And again, to a different approach, this president has decided he's going to cut those cords, but still stay engaged. How that's going to look, how rocky that's going to look, especially in the Middle East. And of course, the Middle East is used to really having us around. We will be around, but in a very different way, I think.
If I could also just say, it ties back a little bit to the conversation we were having before about rules-based order. And when I think about sitting here at a World Affairs Council, like the Council on Foreign Relations, of course, the history of the World Affairs Councils was it all started after World War I, to begin that conversation of what kind of different worlds could we have. They were organizations that were trying to promote the League of Nations.
Yep.
And I think one of the challenges, a little bit like the question of what's the outlier here, is I think the challenge for us, in a way, and for all of us, is to say what you've both said is absolutely right. And now the question is, how do you turn that into 3, 4, 5 declarative sentences that go to the core of a question that Ambassador Romanowski and I were talking about a little bit this morning, which is, how do I take the business philosophy, the business case, the business, definition of return on investment, and how do I apply it to foreign policy?
Yeah.
How do you say those 80 years gave you required this investment, and here was the return on that investment? And if you want to do something different, that's fine. But you need to judge, well, is it going to give you the same return, less return, more return? And I think we have to find ways to say to people, if you invest X, you're going to get Y as much as you can.
Jim, well, you said, I always taught that, we say we should learn the lessons of history. I said, well, one of the lessons we learn is we don't learn from history because we all think we're different and that lesson doesn't apply to us. So we'll go through. And one other point very quickly for students, background is important. Donald Trump has not forgotten Japan. The students in here don't realize that when I was teaching in the 1980s, Japan was going to take over the world. We're going to convert our school system to the Japanese system. I mean, it was panic and fear and tariffs, he thought. So there's some real background that we're not going to get into, but help explain too. All right, it's 8 o'clock, but I want to just get some quick comments from you in my last question here. With the established order undergoing dramatic shifts, we're witnessing the emergence of a new international framework. Power dynamics are evolving. New actors are asserting themselves, and patterns of cooperation are changing. So how do you think this new world order is beginning to shape? And quickly, a quote. I got to find the alternatives to the post-war liberal international order. Eikenberry writes, are various sorts of closed systems, a world of blocks, spheres, protectionist zones. I've heard will now be a multi-power regional area. A lot's been written on this. I'd like to know each of your thoughts. So on this one, Jim, we start with you and then we'll work around.
We're going back to a world that looks more like the world as it did before World War II or before World War I, a world of geopolitical competition. As you look around, obviously, what do they say in the Department of Defense? China has emerged as the pacing threat, while Russia is the acute threat. And that is the world we are in. It's no secret that Xi Jinping has great ambitions for China. I don't know that the Chinese are interested in being a global power dominating the world. They sure want to be the dominant power in Asia and like to see us pushed out from their perspective. It's a matter of restoring natural harmony because China has been around for a very long time, many, many more centuries than the United States. I think you're seeing competition politically, you're seeing competition economically, you're seeing competition militarily. I mean, one of the striking things about China, once it went nuclear in 1964, and actually at the time, Lyndon Johnson and his advisors thought about bombing China because it was getting the bomb, and they decided not to. I think it was a wise decision. But for 40 plus years, the Chinese basically said, okay, we have a couple dozen nuclear weapons. We don't need any more. Well, now that they become wealthier, they decided they're going to match the United States. And they're in the midst of a very large buildup. And I think and this is where diplomacy might be able to help us from going down some very dark roads. But I would not, and this is what people in my business call the security dilemma. Even if you hope you can work things out with the other adversary, you have reasons to worry that they're going to try to pull one over on you. If you're Britain, you're worried about Imperial Germany. If you're France, you're worried about Nazi Germany. This is the nature of world politics, sort of that sort of thing going on. What I worry about for the United States in this more dangerous world is that we are squandering what I consider to be America's great strength. Because I really want to drive home to people that the challenge provided by China is unlike any challenge in American history. This is a country that is 4 times as populous as we are. Okay, if you look at sort of scientific advances, the Chinese are matching or surpassing the United States on issue after issue. Every day I get some studies showing me there are more patents being given to Chinese scientists, that there are more articles being published in the best journals by Chinese scientists, that the Chinese now have such a formidable lead in green technology, quantum computing. that they're going to be able to dominate sort of the industries of the future. Okay, and I just think we haven't come to grips with it. But the great strength the United States always has had is the wisdom to see itself not as a country, but as a country leading others. In essence, to recognize there is strength in numbers. That's the great value of having friends, partners, and allies. And I will point out, we talk about NATO, and Americans get upset because NATO didn't pay their dues. First off, there are no dues. But let me point out that the reason we're getting closer to that 5% goal is because Russia invaded Ukraine. And all of a sudden, for Europeans who took a long holiday from history, there was a realization that they had to face up. And it is not an accident that the countries that border Ukraine and are closest to Russia have the highest military spending as a percentage of GDP. When I talk to my friends in Portugal, as they're drinking a nice red wine, they're not so worried about Soviet things. So I think you need to keep that in mind. But where it leads me off is that what I worry about our approach now is that we are burning up friendships. And you can do that in the short term. You can impose on people, you can hector them, you can put them up against the wall, but eventually people make choices and they can choose to basically step away from you. Okay, it won't happen today, but over time, those little changes. I'll give you one example, the creation of the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was a successor to the TPP agreement the United States negotiated. Trump ripped it up. The assumption in the Trump administration 1.0 was that, well, that's the end of that. Well, what happened? All the other countries surprised us. They actually put together an agreement. And guess what? Now China wants to be a part of it.
It was meant to isolate
It was
China.
meant to isolate China. So and I'll look at even this week. We are having a global climate meeting in Brazil, COP30. I don't believe the United States is there.
Yeah, Governor Newsom is there.
Okay, should be. That's not the federal government. Okay, last I checked, unless there's been something happened over the last couple of hours.
But you're right about the feds are not there.
We're boycotting the G20. Now, there's an old saying about in diplomacy that, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And what I worry about here is that we are self-isolating ourselves and we are squandering what is our greatest strength. We can mobilize others. So that's my fear.
Great. Ambassador Grossman.
Yeah, thank you very much. Again, I think a lot of good points have been made. I would say, what I think about in terms of what the new world will look like really is an expansion perhaps on what Dr. Lindsay talked about, which is geopolitics. I think it's more than geopolitics now, if you would allow me. It's a combination. It's the intersection of geopolitics, geoeconomics, and geotechnology. That's probably not a good word, but all the things that you talked about, this competition in the technological world. And so economics are national security, technologies, national security. And it's the intersection of those things that seem to me are the umbrella in which we're going to have to operate into the future. I would say you could see out a little bit here that there are a number of models at this point that are being talked about. Again, I go back to the point we all made, which is it isn't going back to the way it was. Let me give you 4 models that people are talking about. One of them is in the most recent issue of Foreign Affairs, right, by a writer called Oren Cass, right? And he talks about the grand strategy of reciprocity. Well, I don't know, this may be not a complete thought there in the 20 or so pages of Foreign Affairs, but it's an idea, it's a way forward, it's a way to think about this. And he's arguing that countries who are like-minded in geopolitics, geoeconomics, and geotechnology ought to get together, right? And that would be a new set of alliances. And that there ought to be an effort to exclude those countries, right, that don't think the same way in those 3 areas. I think it's been very interesting to follow this whole question of really important countries that The Economist a couple of years ago called the T25, the transactional 25, right? They're hedging. They're saying, thank you very much. I really don't want to have to choose between the United States, Russia, and China. I'm going to work for the best opportunity and the best deal that I can make for my country. And these are not small countries. These are countries like Turkey. These are countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Malaysia, Indonesia, India. right? So that's a really interesting grouping of countries to work forward. And I think if you're an American diplomat today, either on the military side or the State Department side, you're having to think, how am I going to talk to that group of people, the transactional 25? What do I have to say to them that's going to interest them in working with me? And third, it seems to me that we're at that point where there's a huge number of new combinations. So like you follow the press and you see, the European Union is now signing trade deals with Latin America, right? The European Union is now signing trade deals with Africa, with Asia, new ways of thinking in the Pacific. AUKUS, for example, to build submarines between the United Kingdom, Australia, and the United States. Very importantly, I think, is this question of European future defense. And it does start with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But it isn't just there's more money being spent in NATO. There's an enormous amount of money also being spent on European defense. And I think we'll see a new combination among Europeans that won't include the United States, where they will work hard to have European defense. I actually think that's a really good thing. But it won't be, it won't be uncomplicated.
That's another debate.
It will not be uncomplicated. But,
No, no,
these things
spot
are
on.
coming. You can see, and Ambassador Romanowski will know a lot better than me, you can see a new combination around the Abraham Accords, right? What if over the next year or so, or 2 years, Saudi Arabia finds its way to become part of the Abraham Accords? You have bilateral trade deals versus working with the WTO. And then on the other side, you have Russia and China and Iran and North Korea making themselves a grouping. You have China, as you said, talking about, well, we'll do it our way, thank you very much. And I've noticed over the past couple of weeks, an increasing amount of conversation there about returning to the Belt Road Initiative. Why? Well, because it's a great way to put Chinese influence out there. And I think finally is the question that we all should be thinking about, which is, what is it from the rules-based order? What is it from those 80 years that we ought to be trying to save in this future? And that has, it seems to me anyway, and again, you may disagree, it has to do with America standing up for democracy, for human rights, but especially it has to do with our great strength, which is we attract allies, and we need to keep attracting them. And so as you think about the future and new groupings and new ways, I hope we will keep focused as a diplomatic priority on making sure that we've got allies to be with us.
Ambassador Romanowski, I want a response, but it's 8:15. We want some questions. So if maybe succinct so we can get to some questions.
I have to agree with my two colleagues up here that definitely it's going to be a different order of the world and what we do. But at the same time that we're going to pursue and continue some what I would call high risk and non-conventional approaches, because the environment requires it on the global stage, we're also going to have to make sure that that's only half the equation. We also have to look at how do we adapt in this country to make sure that our domestic policies, our approach can also map to what we want to achieve. We have to redefine our own interests with our allies to attract them. We still want them to invest their sovereign wealth funds in this country because we have to get manufacturing back on the ground, for example. So these two things are going to come together in ways that I don't think that we've actually connected them in the past or the way we should, so that they're mutually reinforcing. On some level, yes, some others, no. I do think the one thing that especially I think President Trump is going to do is he's going to make countries more accountable for not just their own security with the 2%, 5%, but responsible for their region's security. We will be there. NATO's not going to disappear, but there's going to be a difference. We're creating a new security framework in the Middle East. That's a tricky one, but we've been doing it. Abraham Accords is part of that, but there's a bigger one with the Saudis were just in the Oval Office talking about that today, I think, or this week. So but we're not going to be, the emergency button for people, because that's maybe not in our interest. Supporting them, creating situation, yes. So I think it's going to be rocky. It will be we're going to have mixed success. We'll stumble and fumble for a while. We're going to look back but it's not it's the discussion is not anti-globalization, pro-globalization. You can't exist and grow with technology and with economy if you're completely isolated. I think that's the one lesson we learned even before World War I. I mean, that's been progress. So how we take it, how we continue is going to be really important.
Great points. For the students, let me close very quickly. There was an article in the New York Times by a journalist. He went to Marc Grossman in the Netherlands, which is an American cemetery for World War II dead. We have 14 of them there. And I was moved by this paragraph. In today's Europe, the need for such a partner remains. That's your empty throne there. At Marc Grossman that August morning, I spoke with a Dutch woman who'd come to visit the cemetery with her young son. He was learning at school about the problems in the world, she explained. He's a little bit nervous, she said, about what would happen if the Russians come. She gestured at the rows of graves all around. So it's very important to see everything because America came when they needed. So I think that's a good way to end with what you guys had just said. So, all right. Can we have a hand for these? All right, Angela, question.
We do have time for just a couple of quick questions. So if somebody has a question, we're going to go side to side. Sarah's got the microphone over there. I've got the microphone over here.
All right, so you were talking about Europe and the direction we're going. They have a lot of the same problems we have, nationalism. They have multi-party system. The direction we're going, do you think it may end up actually having the inverse effect in keeping the European Union together? That they have some realization that they're better not having an imperial Germany or a united Europe, and they see us somewhat as an adversary to keep them together? Or do you see Europe following our trend and seeing more countries leaving the EU and having more nationalism and going back to the old world order there in Europe specifically, especially Western Europe?
I think it's highly unlikely that the EU is going to come apart at the seams, in good part because our friends in the United Kingdom decided to exit the EU, believing that was going to liberate them. And I think the lesson has been it didn't liberate the United Kingdom, it has impoverished it. And I will note that in Europe now, even though it's always good to run against Brussels, it's very popular, but it's a popular thing to do because it takes the blame off of you. Much like I would argue in this country, the fixation on trade as sort of the be all and end all of all of our problems. The reason where I began my comments is because it's like in medicine, if you don't get the diagnosis right, you're not going to get the prescription right. And I think the fixation on trade is the wrong one to have because that's not the root of our problems. I think our problems are bigger and more systemic. I think that's where a lot of the public unhappiness comes from. And getting out of a ditch that took us 3 or 4 decades to build is not going to be something that's done in any one individual president's term. I do think the Europeans have a challenge, and it was alluded to by Ambassador Grossman. They're spending more money on defense. And there's a lot of talk saying, okay, the United States, Washington is saying to us, we want you to be responsible for yourselves. Be adults, grow up. However, this administration, like administrations going back as long as I can think, when they think of Europe spending more money on defense, they want the Europeans to buy American weapons. Okay, and actually for us, it's a good deal because it reduces unit cost, blah, blah, blah. But if you're European and part of the reason you're spending more money is because you're worried that the United States is not going to be there for you, or you believe that the United States wants you to be self-sufficient, you don't want to do that because you don't want to imagine something comes up and America doesn't come to your aid. You're dependent on the United States to provide you with parts. Well, look at Ukraine right now. Would you come away from that experience and say, yeah, I'm going to build a dependency? So I think, again, as the ambassador said, it's it's really easy, and people in my business think tank world are really good at sort of sketching out broad solutions. But the devil really often is in the details.
I also think that the Europeans now see a more unified EU on things like Ukraine and the Russians, and even China, that's a little squishier, that they need to stay together. And that experiment with the UK having left the way they did, and the dismantling of it was a mess. And they learned from that, and that's not what they want to see now. 10 years, 15, 20 years later, if it doesn't work, that's a different scenario. But right now, I think they're more committed to keeping the EU together, strengthen numbers, especially remember there's huge immigration issues in Europe. And they can deal with that in a better way, united.
I don't have anything to add. I'd glad to take another question.
We can't forget declining populations too, when we talk about immigration too.
My question is, maybe the three of you can comment on how do you see this war right now, Russian and the Ukraine war, going to be end? With that kind of compared to a little bit to like World War One, and or maybe pre-World War One stage.
I think Ambassador Grossman should go first, since we didn't give him the mic on the last question.
Yeah,
So
no. I don't think the war in Ukraine radiates instability. So this war has got to end at some stage. And that's beyond the human cost, the physical costs. The war has to come to some conclusion. And this may not be a particularly popular thing to say, but I'll just speak for myself. I see that at some stage, a little bit like Ambassador Romanowski was talking about the Middle East, the way wars end a lot of times is people just get tired of fighting and they just can't fight anymore. And I think what will happen is there's going to be a point at which the Russians and the Ukrainians have just killed enough of each other. They spent enough money. They've shed enough blood, and there's going to be a long pause, and it won't solve any of the underlying problems. And it's going to be what kind of we know as a frozen conflict. And it's going to stay tense, and it's going to stay upset, and it's going to stay messy for a really long time. But if you think about kind of the diplomat's solution to this, I think that's better. That would be better than where we are. And maybe if you had a long enough period of pause and let some diplomatic effort go into it, you might be able to come to some kind of ceasefire, conclusion, end. It won't solve all the problems, but will stop this conflict, which, just as I say, for the United States, just radiates instability. I think there are some fundamental principles, which is the Russians can't take all of Ukraine. Ukrainians should be able to decide their own lives. But I don't see how this can go on and on and on in its present circumstance.
Any possibility of U.S. will get involved?
Not under this administration, I don't think so. I think that, President Biden was involved. You can argue the question of, whether he should have been involved, as we were talking about earlier, Don, more forcefully and earlier. I personally don't think it was a terrible position to be in to say, we'll support Ukraine. We don't want to start World War III. And so here we are. I don't think this administration will ever put American troops on the ground. I don't think the American public would support it. I think we'll continue through the system that we have now, which is Europeans buy American weapons, the American weapons go to Ukraine. I think that could continue for some time. But I don't think that the United States of America will intervene in the way we know that word in Ukraine. I don't.
It's quite, I agree with you, Mark, but I do think that if Putin miscalculates and decides to open another front and essentially broaden the war, either in the Baltics or in
Oy.
Poland, then I think there's a
Yeah.
whole different dynamic.
That's a different,
Yeah.
that's
And
a
I think
different.
Americans would change because that makes it. But I do think we have experience in these protracted conflicts, especially in the Middle East between Palestinians, Israelis, et cetera, where we've had, lulls in the level of violence, and then we try, another peace plan, another approach. And then we saw, October 7th flares up, and we won't go into the history of that. So I really don't see a conclusion, a definitive conclusion on Ukraine for quite a while.
I'd say to put it to follow up, because a goal of this pause would be to make sure that it does not turn into
Right.
a Russia-NATO question, right? So you don't want to face an Article 5 question. You don't want to face a NATO treaty question with the Baltic states, with Poland, as we talked about before. There's a reason that they spend more money, they spend more of their GDP on defense, and rightly so. So that's a really important point, and right to be made.
I would just say quickly, I'm a big fan of diplomacy and diplomats because it's better to jaw than war, as Winston Churchill put it. But you can have the world's or history's greatest diplomats, and they can't solve an issue until the time is ripe.
Right.
Yes.
And I don't think we're near a ripening point yet. And I think that President Putin is going to pursue this, and he has the ability to absorb an awful lot of pain to keep this going. Now, the question would be, could something happen in Russia that would change that calculation? But that's one of those things that you can speculate about, but nobody can predict. All I know is my friends who follow Russia closely say there are no signs of any splits in the leadership in Russia that would suggest perhaps something might change.
We have time for one last question here.
Hello. First off, thank you guys so much for coming to this small town. I know a lot of us, like students, high schoolers and college students, we're speakers and debaters and like council on foreign relations. That's something we have to read all the time. So like,
I'm sorry. I apologize.
no. It's so I'm kind of having
Better
like
than
almost like not fangirl per se, but like a whole huge like whoa moment. But kind of more of a general question, like for people looking to get into, diplomacy, something that I've always been like kind of concerned about is like, what is the importance of like charisma and, proper communication, especially with this new like administration where they're very clear about like, this is what we want and so on and so forth. Just because like, at least me personally, I've always been kind of interested, but I'm always like, oh, I don't know, like, what do I, like, how do you guys navigate those conflicts so like, a war doesn't blow up or something like that? Thank you.
Well, I can't answer your question because I'm one of those people that just write stuff they make you read. So I'm going to turn it over to diplomats and ask them.
Without sounding, too flippant, how many seasons of The Diplomat have you watched? To the early part of your question, there's a lot to be said for charisma. There's a lot to be said for how you engage. It doesn't mean that the sort of uncharismatic person won't be successful, but it takes creative thinking. You have to go back to the topics over and over again, and it's like playing multi-dimensional chess. You've got to think on multiple levels.
Yeah, I think that's right. Certainly, I don't know how many diplomats have ever been accused of having a lot of charisma. So I appreciate that.
That's why they made The Diplomat.
That's right. That's exactly right.
To disabuse everybody.
Yes, that's why it's a film and not our lives. I think first of all, let me say to all of you that I hope that you'll keep this interest in foreign affairs. I hope you'll keep an interest in public service. and I hope you'll keep an interest in serving the United States of America. All I can say is that the 30-some years and many more for Ambassador Romanowski, it was just a privilege to work in an office where the American flag flies. That's a privilege that is great. And so I hope you'll continue that. As the ambassador said to a number of students beforehand, there are many different ways to serve the United States overseas. And the possibilities now are so much greater than when we were starting out, right? There's so many more ways to do it. So I hope you'll continue to keep that passion for it. On the charisma question, I think it's great, but it's charisma for what? For what purpose? And so that's why in diplomacy, charismatic people have a place. People who are less charismatic have a place. Introverts have a place, because it's how is it that you do this job? And so it's all of what you bring is what you bring, but you have to say, for what purpose? What am I going to do with this gift that I have, or the skills that I want to create?
Bravo.
Dr. Lindsay talked a little bit to the previous student group about, what's the great value of people in Washington, D.C. You succeed there, as you do in the rest of your life, because you get a reputation for being somebody who can get something done, right? And so you bring your skills and your capacities and your passion, and then you put them to a purpose. And it's that combination that's the magic.
And you read a lot about what they write, and then
Right.
then you decide whether it was a good idea.
No, then we grade how you implemented it. So there you go.
Yeah, and then
Turnabout is fair
It's such
play.
a symbiotic relationship.
I want to thank you three for my idea has been fulfilled with your observations tonight. And let me leave you with John Bolton, I've heard, would answer it, let's just bomb them. And that's how he would solve all of this.
Is Coke still here? That's Coke. That's the solution to every global problem. But Ambassador Grossman, thank you very much for putting a plug in, for staying engaged, staying informed, and staying excited about the world. And the best way to do that is to join the World Affairs Council. So there are